everyone. Andy, can you please call the roll?
Yes. I'll call your name. Please respond in the affirmative if you're present. Chad Washington. Thought I saw Chad on the call. Maybe not. We'll come back. Bob Van Dyke.
Here.
Kristen Rivard.
Here.
Keith Curtis.
Here.
Fran Caparata. Andrew Perkey. Mark Stern.
Present.
Mark Granbemmer. Jennifer Reichel.
Jason Miner here for ODF in lieu of Jennifer.
Okay, thank you. I see Andrew's here.
Yes, here.
Just a minute, guys. Kate Wells.
Here.
Right when I was typing it. Great. Chris Allen.
Here.
And Sarah Gregory.
Hi, everybody. I'm here.
Perfect. I'm going to call for Chad Washington once more. Are you present, Chad?
Yep, I'm here, Andy.
Okay, perfect. So just mark on Fran. All right, we have a quorum, Bob. We can go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andy, and welcome everyone. Our first item, or the way we start business, is by approving the agenda, which has been posted. Do I hear any comments, additions to the agenda before I call for approval? Mark Stern?
Yeah, I think with the benefit of everybody here, just to sort of circle back and touch base again on our discussion on the acquisition that we had at the last meeting, particularly in light of some of the public comment we've got. So if there's an opportunity to visit on that, I think that'd be helpful.
Okay, I think we can probably squeeze that in. Andy, do you know where we are with public comment? Have we received any requests for public comment today?
We had public testimony submitted, so that was sent to all of you and posted online. I haven't received any additional one unless at this point someone would like to speak up at the opportunity. And just for Mark's point, we do have some time on October agenda for acquisition discussion specifically, by the way, so it's a pretty packed meeting.
Okay, well, I guess I'm going to suggest if we don't have public comment, let's go ahead and use a few minutes just to get some ideas out during that.
Well,
I see Kelly Beamer is there raising her hand. All right, well, I'd like to give us a few minutes. So let's take our public comment after approving the agenda. We'll spend a few minutes hearing if folks have thoughts to share, and then we can have a more robust discussion about the adoptions question. Part of the acquisitions question. So,
Bob, before moving on, can we make sure everybody mutes themselves? There's some background noise. Just a reminder to everyone who's not speaking to go on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. I was getting some noise there too. Thanks everybody and thanks for that reminder. Okay, are there any objections to adopting the or other additions? Any other additions to the agenda or comments on the agenda? Okay, any objections to the agenda that's currently run? Okay, well, I'm looking for unanimous consent. So if there's any objections, I'm not hearing any objections. So we'll adopt the agenda without objection as written. Our first topic then is public comment. So, pardon me, is the consent agenda. So let's turn now, I'm sorry, was missing that on my agenda here. We've just got the meeting minutes. Are there any comments, amendments to the meeting minutes? Okay, well, hearing none, without objection, I'll consider those adopted. Let's now move to the public comment section. Andy, I'll turn to you to facilitate that.
Thank you, Bob. All right, at this point, if someone has public comment, please unmute here. Kelly Brimmer, I'm going to ping to you.
Great. Can folks hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Excellent.
Okay.
Thank you. Patching through from Tryon Creek State Park. So thanks for the opportunity to comment. For the record, my name is Kelly Beamer. I'm the Executive Director of the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. I'm coming to you today to respond to the dialogue that happened during the last Mitigation Fund Committee meeting about removing land acquisition as an eligible and type of grant program for the first round of funding. And I want to clarify, we have submitted written comments, which you all have in your inboxes, and I'm here today on behalf of 32 organizations that are mostly nonprofit, but also soil and water conservation districts from all over the state and national level that participate in this work in Oregon. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on high-level thoughts. Just as Andy said, I know this isn't a decision point for today. You all will talk about this in October, but since we weren't able to join the last meeting, I did want to respond. And I first wanted to focus on, my first point is land acquisition is a proven mitigation strategy. Land trusts work with willing landowners to protect public benefits on private lands through conservation easements and acquisitions. And these are explicitly mentioned as tools to reduce as a threat to reduction elimination strategy in the private forest accords. And scientific literature is clear that for salmon, successful restoration includes protecting natural functions for the long haul. And our members do this work in perpetuity. So the types of investments that can be made are going to endure and allow for restoration to continue despite, if an easement is placed on land, despite that land changing hands. For an example, many of our members rely on funding from the Willamette Wildlife Mitigation Program to protect habitat for fish and wildlife throughout the Willamette River Basin. And this is funded through the BPA, but administered by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Our letter includes an example of McKenzie River Trust that purchased 1,000 acres on Green Island, located at the confluence of the McKenzie and the Willamette River. It's really a phenomenal project that since the acquisition has occurred, the land trust has restored really critical channels for endangered and threatened species and are providing critical habitat for juvenile spring and Chinook and Oregon chub. The second point I want to make is land conservation is a market-based tool. It's voluntary and it supports the financial needs of the landowner, whether that's a family, whether that's industrial landowner, TIMO, et cetera. It's really about the bottom line. And our work is a collaborative model that both meets the financial needs of a landowner and the mission of the land trust nonprofit organization. Third, conserved lands are working lands. Most land, especially forest land that moves into ownership or management by a land trust, is actively managed with harvest that support stewardship goals. The revenue from that goes right back into managing and supporting those public funding goal outcomes. And in the case of the Forest Accords, that's uplift for the species mentioned in the Habitat Conservation Plan. And last, I just want to end with our ask. My ask, and on behalf of our coalition, is that you consider not closing the door on land acquisitions for the first year. This program could provide a critical source of match that would get projects to the finish line, especially projects that have passed the very rigorous review of federal funding programs like the Forest Legacy that has to actually travel up to a national competitive level. We have a project on the docket we know for sure that has secured Forest Legacy funding and Metro, and this source of funding could bring it to the finish line. And so I do ask that going forward in October, that the committee consider please opening the door to projects that have passed the muster of co-funding sources. And we also stand here to provide support as ODFW stands up an acquisition program. And just appreciate all of your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments or questions for Kelly? Any questions for Kelly? Thank you, Kelly, for being here. Okay, seeing none, let's see if there are anyone else who would like to testify. Okay, well, let's turn, if we may then, briefly to this acquisition topic. I want to start by providing what I think is a brief, accurate summary. One is that there's concern among ODF&W staff, and in particular, about being able to do quality diligence on an acquisition. So can take quite a significant workload when dealing with acquisitions. So I think there's some concern in the first year about being able to provide that. I think there's some general concern among some members of the committee on acquisitions as a more general matter. I'll say for myself, I'm amenable to having acquisitions in the first year, but they would have to meet a kind of vetting bar where we felt like the ODF&W staff weren't required to do a bunch of new work related to specific acquisitions, but that the acquisitions had been sufficiently vetted in other places. So I'll just offer up those two observations and then a comment from my view. Heath, I see your hand, please.
Yeah, you know, a couple comments on this, and we won't go super long. I struggle with how to think about acquisitions in the sense that, you know, one, I find it a little unfortunate given, you know, the dialogue around, you know, acquiring productive timberland with PFA mitigation advisory committee dollars, that before we've even sent out our first recruitment for proposals, that we have a project for the retirement of thousands of acres in the Tualatin Mountain forest with PFA dollars. And the reason I say I struggle with how to think about it is that it's not clear to me to what degree PFA money does or does not facilitate this project. That is to say, is it the case that the PFA dollars are the linchpin for this project? That is to say, that without these dollars, this project would not go forward? If that's not true, that is to say that this is one source of funding to facilitate the local match for tens of millions of dollars of investment to retire forest land in Oregon, then to what degree is it true? That is to say, is this just an option? And if it is just an option, then to what degree can we claim credit for the conservation uplift? That is, to the degree that this project is resulting in additional protection for fish, and I don't know, we'll see the proposal. I struggle with analyzing how our investment can claim that credit if in fact it is not also claiming credit for the retirement of thousands of acres of timberland. So like you, Bob, I don't think that it's necessary that we shut the door to acquisitions. I'm a little worried about Kelly styling it as standing up an acquisition program. Oh my God, right? This is the thing I've been worried about. But to the degree that acquisitions are a part of PFA mitigation funding, I think we really need to grapple with both sides of that coin. To what degree are we taking credit for the conservation uplift? And to what degree is this fund being used to retire thousands of acres of timberland?
Great, thanks, Heath. I see Chad next in the queue. Chad Washington, please.
Thanks, Bob. I share some of Heath's concern, mostly around if there's not an imminent threat of conversion, then to what degree does an acquisition actually achieve any uplift? If timberlands are going to be managed to the new rules that we all agreed upon, then to what degree does an acquisition change or go above and beyond those rules to mitigate or offset take? And I would just need some assurances by the services that changing the name on the title is enough to qualify as mitigation. At the very least, I would like to see some kind of deed restrictions or conservation easements. And I think conservation easements are certainly within the scope. It's listed in the PFA authors report. It's listed in the Senate bill. Acquisitions of water rights are as well. But property, it's not specifically listed. The only place that shows up is in the OARs. So I don't know. I struggle with the acquisitions. Does it meet the benchmark of qualifying as mitigation? And does it do so without any restrictions to the title? That's kind of where I'm at with that.
Great, thank you. Thank you for those, Chad. Mark's turn. I think you're on mute, I think, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I have two thoughts to share, and apologies, my internet connection may be a little soft, so if I'm squeaky, sorry about that. I guess the first one is, I think it's any land acquisition really has to be incumbent on the applicant to demonstrate that this is going to be a benefit to the covered species, and that's kind of the threshold for all of our projects. And sort of Heath and Chad, to your points, I mean, yeah, we're not trying to take land out of production. We're not trying to retire forest land. That it's got to have a real direct connection to benefiting these covered species. And I think it's, again, the job of the applicant to make the case that the acquisition is critical to that outcome. And if they can prove it, great. And if they can't, so be it. I think also, you know, Chad, you mentioned conversion, and I know sometimes, you know, conversion can be some of these smaller forest tracts can be, I'm going to use subject to development and being parcelized, if you will. So those are the kind of things that come to my mind as I look out at those issues that might be best used by the landowner. So something that I can consider. And then I guess really sort of a question of capacity, a question for Andy and Sarah. I know ODF&W has other programs like the Restoration and Enhancement Board. Sometimes acquisition projects come through there. In some ways, these types of PFA mitigation projects would be similar. I'm just wondering if there was an urgent need in the beginning, if that program has some ability to help guide sort of PFA funds in that pathway under the conditions that I think, Bob, you suggested, which is maybe the project's been fully vetted by OWEB or the Forest Legacy group, so that ODF&W is not sort of on the front end of all of the due diligence there. So a little bit of a ramble, but I think you all can hear the points I'm making there.
We can. I did want to note we lost just a little bit. You got a little bit squeaky, as you put it there at one point, but I think 98% came through, Mark. I'm seeing Kristen and then Chad again, and then Sarah. Just a reminder, we're squeezing this in, so we'll keep this agenda item short, but I certainly want to have everybody get a chance to speak. Kristen, please.
The only thing I wanted to add, I guess, echoes Mark's comments that I'm reluctant to defer to another agency's review because the intent of this program is very different than the intent of other programs. So I would feel much more confident to embark in an acquisition program when we have our own protocols, procedures, and support for that, or at a minimum, some sort of crosswalk between what other agency reviews we're willing to accept and what additional layers of review need to happen beyond that. I just continue to feel ill-prepared at this point to do a good job assessing that, unless we've got the staff support in place to be able to do it.
Thank you, Chad, and then Sarah.
Yeah, well, my comment's no longer necessary because Kristen took the words right out of my mouth. That pre-vetting by some other agency doesn't necessarily mean that the vetting was in alignment with this fund's goals and objectives. The Forest Legacy Program is very different than the mitigation fund. And any projects pre-vetted through Forest Legacy is a rigorous process, but it's not in alignment with our goals and objectives. And I would hate to set a precedent that this fund becomes the match to prop up Forest Legacy projects in Oregon.
Sarah? Did you want to?
Yeah, ditto. I lowered my hand. Kristen said it exactly how I would have framed it for the agency as well, that we're just not really clear what, other agencies' reviews we could just sort of accept without needing to do our own secondary review. And that's where we really think this all just needs more conversations so that we can have our own protocols and procedures that align with the goals of the PFA. So that's where we stood last time when we recommended waiting until next fall on acquisitions, and that's where we still are.
Okay, I guess I will just say that from my view, it's certainly the case that any acquisition that was going to be considered would have to meet all of our grant criteria in terms of purposes and effects regarding the effects on the covered species. I think the question for me is whether some of the diligence regarding processes and property rights, et cetera, if some of those might be adequately covered by a process that was undertaken by another agency. But I certainly agree that we'd need a crosswalk to make sure we had, first we'd have to decide here's what we're going to need for comfort. And then we'd need to be able to say, okay, the other agency is providing adequately, or we need something supplemental that they've covered part of our needs, but we want supplemental information in addition. So any other comments, closing comments on this one? Andrew, please. Perky.
Yeah, I just want to return, Bob, to your initial comment and just ask the question, are there any acquisitions that we would consider this fall if they meet a certain standard, or are we deciding that, consistent with what was discussed in August, that we're deferring this for a year?
Yeah, well, I guess my view, just to respond briefly, is we haven't decided that exactly. I don't know if we need to decide it today. Andy, I'll look to you. Could we decide it at our early October meeting and still be in good shape? Okay, so maybe there's a little diligence in between there. Mark,
Thank you.
a final comment, Mark Stern, please.
No, I think having more discussion in October is good. I think the other avenue that's always open, at least if the grants process goes forward as we've talked about it, is that there's urgent grants, which could make its own case for something specific there that might be another avenue if it was really urgent and needed to happen sooner rather than later.
Very good. Thank you, Mark, for that. Thanks, everybody, for that thoughtful conversation. Let's turn now to the staff report. Andy?
All right, everyone, give me just a quick second to bring up my notes here. I'm gonna I sent you all a pre-meeting packet with the staff report, so I won't go into too much detail. I'm just gonna do some general reminders, and then I was kind of hoping that to use the time for any questions from anyone on materials that I've sent to all of you. So right off the top, the grant guidelines, they are currently going through an internal review and an external review. Thank you all for submitting your comments and feedback about 2 weeks ago. So I wrapped those up, sent them internally, and we also have an external group taking a look, providing comments. I do hope to get a clean draft on my return from my trip by the end of September and get it out to the committee before the October meeting. That is the goal, is one combined draft of the grant guidelines and all attachments. So that's the scope of work. That's the application cover page and everything else. So I hope to get to you guys. I am working with our information and education on the public informational grant session. That's essentially, for all intents and purposes, can be thought of as a webinar for our grant program. We're looking to record that ahead of time and then do a live Q&A with community members or prospective applicants. So more to come with that, but we are looking to record something by the end of this month, process it and post it sometime in October in anticipation for our fall launch. That would pretty much answer everything an applicant would want to know from applying to the grant, how eligibility and all that good stuff, and an opportunity to engage with ODF&W directly. Third point was just noting some of the project reporting requirements. I did send that in your, and I bring this up because there's previous discussion asking at the last meeting about what we're doing for reporting. So I attached a brief, a memo that brought up different aspects that we've highlighted for reporting. So I attached some language from our quarterly reports we're going to request from applicants, our mid-project performance reports and final reporting, some metrics and some language. You guys all have that. It's a pretty detailed memo, so I just want to point you to that again. And then lastly, I was asked at the last meeting, or maybe it was the one before, about a funding floor and ceiling and looking at other ODF and W programs and what might be recommendation for implementation type programs for a floor. I did some looking around at other, push passage projects that we've given money for, paid for, and it looks like 50,000 was the primary recommendation of a floor, which I originally recommended as it to also help with administrative bottlenecks, possibly. So my recommendation, kind of moving forward, is that, maybe for this first round, we either formally say a floor of 50,000, or we informally say there's no floor or ceiling, but we do expect projects to be in the range of 50,000 to 2 million. That might be some in between there. Anyways, with that, I didn't want to get into too much detail about those points. There's more info in that staff report, also posted online for people on the call. But I wanted to use this time if anyone had any questions from any of those documents that you've reviewed.
Floor is open now for questions on these topics for Andy. Mark Stern, please.
Yeah, thanks, Andy, for that update there. Just a couple minor observations, I guess. I noticed in the framework, expenditure framework, and maybe we're going to talk about that yet, but you make reference to very minor reporting requirements. But I would say reading your memo on the quarterly reporting requirements, they don't particularly seem minor to me. So that's maybe just something to sync up on there in terms of the language. And also just a suggestion, also, again, and you mentioned the grant guidelines are going to be finalized sometime in the next month or so. I think in your expenditure framework, you send people to the ODF and ODF and W web pages for it, but then there's no grant guidelines document there. And I realize that's probably because it's not finalized yet, but even just a placeholder there that says, to be provided in October or whatever, I think would help people at least follow the guidance they're being given there, would be helpful.
Thank you for that, Mark. And we do plan with our new website going live soon. There will be a placeholder there. So I appreciate those comments. So.
And then you and talking with others, including OWEB, may have a better idea on sort of the floor for grants. And obviously we're going to learn more when we see how many applicants we have and applications and whatnot. I think a lot of the people that could apply for PFA money could also apply for OWEB money. And so in terms of the capacity issue, I might lean a little bit with the PFA money to go to a higher minimum just to try and generate bigger projects at scale of some sort, realizing that those that were seeking had a smaller amount could probably work their way through OWEB. So I think we'll have the ability in different RFP cycles to change it, but I would tend to leave to sort of a higher minimum just so that, you get 20 projects rather than 45 projects.
Thank you, Mark.
Heath, please.
Two items. One, I'm willing to defer to Mark on this. I was actually going to make the opposite point, which I think is probably also a decent point. That is to say, I would hate to preclude great projects that are small dollar or really big dollar on either end. Like, if they're very compelling, why would we arbitrarily draw lines? But that said, I appreciate the kind of staff work. I think Andy kind of proposed a decent compromise. That is to say, we're not going to have a floor and a cap, but we generally expect projects to be between X and Y. But you're right, Mark, that may solicit a lot more proposals that are very small and not of great interest to the agency. So honestly, after hearing you say that, I'm willing to defer to others and what they think is the right approach there. Bob, we are going to have a separate item on the expenditure framework. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's coming up for adoption as the next item.
Very good. Thanks.
Chad Washington, please.
Along the same lines as Mark and Heath's comments, sometimes OWEB will recommend projects for funding, but they're out of dollars. And so, if we were going to try to push applicants more towards OWEB for smaller grants, to Heath's point, I'd hate to see a culvert replacement or a bridge replacement go unfunded because OWEB was out of money, and that's kind of where we directed them. So if we are going to raise that minimum floor, I think, there's nothing wrong with that, but I'd also like OWEB to then direct some of those unfunded projects back to us so that it kind of goes back and forth. Because if there's a project that's a lower dollar project but has a lot of uplift for the species, I would like to make sure that our fund is able to fill that gap. So just trying to create that two-way street between OWEB and the PFA funds.
Thanks, Chad. Mark Stern again, please, and then Chris Allen.
Yeah, I don't have a strong feeling about it one way or another. You both make a good point that you could have a really valuable project that's low cost, and maybe we don't want to exclude them. I guess I'd really defer to some extent to Andy and Sarah on capacity and how they want to manage it, because they're going to have to work through it. So there's pluses and minuses either way, and I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer.
Chris?
I agree with the points being raised here, pros and cons, but I also, one thing we haven't noted is just something that makes projects often attractive is cost share. And it could be a large project with a number of partners, but they only need 20K or 50K to get them over the line. And so I think just with that acknowledgement, I think we should be open to a lower cap below 50, at least in some circumstances, or maybe we just somehow build in the discretion to have that flexibility if we want it.
Thanks. I just want to note that we are, of course, building this as we're going along. So this will be an iterative process. And so, we obviously could pick some guidelines and put them out there this time, see what comes in, see how it works. If we found out like, all the projects were small dollar, we didn't give the money away, we could actually hold another round of funding if we thought we needed to, or encourage those projects to approach us on urgent grants because we had funds. So there's discretion, I think, for the committee to do those kinds of things. Does anyone want to make a motion on this point? I think where we are now is, Andy's said that, recommending that in general grants, of 50,000 and more or 2 million or less are what the committee has in mind without having super hard deadlines. I think it's a good point about, there may be $100,000 project that only needs $10,000, and do we not want to provide that funding? Well, that's, I think that's the kind of question we approach. Does anyone want to make a motion on this? Andy, maybe you could just bring some specific language next time to the meeting for us to look at, and we can firm something up there.
Sounds
Yeah,
good.
Bob, your comment about just in general, this is what we were looking for, some sideboards without it being definitive seems comfortable.
Yeah,
Okay.
me too. Do we need to wait? I'm not super invested in this, but I can make that motion if you want.
Yeah, as it stands right now in the grant guidelines, it does say, there's no minimum or ceiling, but it is expected to be between 50,000 and 2 million. That's as it stands. So yeah, we could, if you guys are comfortable.
Well,
Can
yeah,
we say
wait.
anticipate instead of expect, just to soften it a little bit and the sideboards, and then I'm comfortable like Heath is.
Yeah, you make that motion and I'll second.
Okay. Andy, is that good for you to just tweak
Yep.
that language a little bit? I move that we adopt that language.
Heath, I see a second.
Yes.
Is there any discussion on the motion? So the motion, just to clarify, is that the grant guidelines will state that the committee anticipates grants will be in the range of 50,000 to $2 million. So, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other questions on any of the other staff?
I'm seeing Sarah with a hand up.
Yeah, thanks. And for the sake of the public, I should have introduced myself the last time I spoke. I'm Sarah Reif, the Habitat Division Administrator with ODFW, working with Andy to build the grant program. And I just wanted to go back to Mark's Mark Stern's other comment about reporting requirements, and that what Andy sent around doesn't seem quite as simple as the expenditure framework would lead you to believe. And I think that's true, Mark. I will just put a pin in the reporting requirements topic. I feel like that is an area that may need a little bit more focus, a little bit more work, and might be an additional agenda item for next time around. I think it's somewhat of an evolving picture as we continue the conversations with Department of Forestry and with the federal services related to the crosswalk between the Habitat Conservation Plan and this grant program. And so I think that's an area that's still a very active area of the grant guidelines.
Thank you for that, Sarah. I'm not sure we closed up that motion adequately though. And I did want to just check.
Oh, my apologies.
No worries. I just wanted to double check if there were any more comments or on that motion with the 50 to 2 million or objections. Are there any objections to the motion? Okay, well, seeing none, then we'll adopt it by unanimous consent. And I'll just go on to say, I agree with Sarah. There's a lot of complexity regarding reporting and monitoring and the needs for the permit for monitoring of mitigation projects versus the need of the program to know that projects are being implemented with the money that's being given away. So at this point, it seems like we need more information from the services and some models of other HCPs regarding mitigation monitoring to help us understand what's needed here and who's going to do it and how much it's going to cost and who bears the burdens. And those feel like longer conversations to me. So thanks for that, Sarah.
Yeah, sorry to jump the gun there.
Yeah, no worries. Any other comments or questions about the topics, the grant guidelines, the reporting requirements, the funding ceiling and floor? Well, we've dealt with the ceiling and floor. Anything else in the staff report that committee members would like to address? Okay, well then we'll close up that item and we will go to our next item, which is the adoption of the expenditure framework. Andy, can you give us I see I'm down as the chair. Well, I certainly can lead that discussion, but I will just say, I think from my view, the expenditure framework doesn't have the same weight as some of the documents. I find it to be a useful summary of a lot of the work that we've put together, but in some ways it seems to largely be subservient to the things we've adopted already or the things that are yet to be adopted, like the grant guidelines. Andy, anything to add there, or thing you'd like to flag for us in the expenditure report that you think is a policy statement in particular or something that needs attention there?
No, what you just said, Bob, I would echo. That's exactly what I was thinking. So thank you for that.
Keith, I see your hand up, please.
Yeah, so to our earlier conversation, I had a thought I'd like to suggest to the group. At the bottom of page 2 of the expenditure framework, there's a statement that says, furthermore, Senate Bill 1501 in the report lists a variety of activities likely to contribute to effective mitigation, including but not limited to the following. And the top bullet in the right-hand column reads, acquisition of land and interests in land, including conservation easements. The rule that we adopted, that acquisition of land and interest in land, including conservation of easements, does not actually appear in 1501 or the report. That's not language that's there. It is, however, the language that is in the rule, but it's styled a little bit differently. It says eligible projects may include, and it says supporting acquisition of land and interest in land, including conservation. And that was compromise language, you'll recall, because at the time we said, we don't know for sure. Like it could, acquisitions of land may actually contribute to conservation, but we didn't know and we would assess it when it came to us. And so I have 2 alternative proposals to remedy this. We could either handle this the way we handled it in the rule, which is to say the following list could lead to effective mitigation, or alternatively, we could modify that bullet to say, instead of acquisition of land and interest in land, I would be satisfied if it just said acquisition of interests in land, including conservation easements. Because I think we're all in agreement there that conservation easements are an acquisition of interest in land. Those are called out in the document, and depending on what the restrictions are, those may very well be effective mitigation. So my proposal, my ask would be that the language be modified in one of those two ways. Either we qualify the entire list to say a list of a variety of activities that could contribute to effective mitigation instead of are likely to contribute to effective mitigation, because I don't think I can say that about acquisition of interest in land. Or alternatively, we could modify the top right bullet to say acquisition of interests in land, including conservation easements. I suspect the conservation or the land trust community may prefer the latter solution. I would prefer the former.
Pardon
Would
me,
be
just for
satisfied with
clarify, Heath, do you prefer the could contribute? Is that what you prefer?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
That is to say, to handle it in the same way we did in the rule. In the rule, we said that eligible projects may include, and it's supporting acquisition of land and interest in land. And I think that we could say in this here, instead of saying likely to contribute, I would say activities that could contribute effectively. And that's probably intellectually more honest. Like any of these may or may not, but they certainly could.
Mark Stern, please.
I don't have it open in front of me, but I think I remember reading through that section. I guess I'm a little more comfortable with the may include, because I think any of those projects may have that benefit. Just because you do whatever's on that list of projects doesn't mean you're going to have a benefit to covered species. So it seems to me may include applies to all of them.
Agreed. Agreed.
Other comments on this?
Mark, are you seeing may and could as synonymous essentially, or is there something about may that's different than could for you?
Synonymous.
Okay.
Synonymous.
Great.
And they are to me too. I think could might actually either would work in that sentence. That actually works.
I would say may is kind of what we've been using for other documents anyway, so for consistency, it might be best.
Yes, that may contribute to effective mitigation. And I'm good with that.
So I'll just call on myself and say I'm fine. And that seems like the cleanest solution is just to say may contribute. And frankly, I think it's more accurate as well, in that, a project like this may not be likely to contribute depending on where and when it happened. Any concern? Let's have a Heath, could you just make a formal motion with that?
Yeah. So would you like me to move the expenditure framework generally with that modification, Bob? Now that
why don't? Yeah. Well, actually, let's hold on for that.
You want to do two? Do you want me to move the framework and then move the amendment?
Why don't you just go ahead and move your amendment at this point, and we'll do the change, and then we'll see if there's more discussion, and then we'll move the whole framework. So.
Oh, that's backwards, but that's fine by me. I'll just say, for purposes of the framework we're going to consider, I would move that the last full sentence at the bottom of page 2 be modified to read, furthermore, Senate Bill 1501 and the report list a variety of activities that may contribute to effective mitigation, including but not limited to the following in the bullets.
Is there a second of that motion?
I second the motion.
Is there any discussion? Any discussion of the motion? Any objections to the adoption of the motion? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to find unanimous consent there, and we'll consider that adopted. And sorry, Heath, you are correct. I'm going backwards here. So we now have a new document in front of us that has a may instead of a likely to. in it. Are there any other comments on this document, questions, things people would like to raise about the expenditure framework? Mark Stern, please.
Yeah, I'll just go back to my earlier comment where it says minor reporting requirements, and I suggest we delete the word minor because, Sarah, I agree with you. I think the reporting requirements are going to be significant, so that'd just be a minor fix there.
Okay. I see the mess I've created now. Are there other comments on this document? Any other questions?
No other questions or comments, Bob. Are you ready? I'll make a motion to adopt them with Mark Stern's request to remove the word minor.
Great. Go ahead and make that motion, please, Chad.
Great. Move to adopt the expenditure framework with a recent amendment from Heath Curtis and with the minor correction, removing the word minor from the reporting requirements from Mark Stern.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, that's Mark Stern with a second. Any discussion of the motion? The motion that has been amended in the document that's been amended in two ways with the change in May and the minor. Andrew Perkey, please.
Yeah, I would just encourage us to make sure that in October we have an adequate amount of time and the right space for this discussion about acquisitions. I mean, one of the things I've learned as I've joined this group is the real concern of the industry about acquisitions, but also the real hope of the land trust community to seek funding from this program for acquisitions. And a lot of our discussion on process and guidance has been opening the door to that conversation, which I know is not going to be an easy conversation, but I just really encourage us to have a good conversation about it in October. I think it's really important.
Any other comments on the expenditure framework on the motion? Okay, hearing none, let's go ahead and do a roll call on this one. Can you call the roll, please, on the expenditure framework as amended, Andy?
Yes, just a minute here. All right, I'll do a roll call. Please respond in the affirmative as for the amendments to the framework. Chad Washington.
Yay.
Bob Van Dyke.
Yay.
Kristen Regard.
Yay.
Heath Curtis.
Yes.
Andrew Perkey.
Yes.
Mark Stern.
Yes.
All right. That is it. All yes, Bob.
All right, that expenditure framework has been adopted. Andy, thanks to you particularly, as well as the whole team for the work folks put in on that. Let's now turn to the ODFW. Thank you for those who've been patiently waiting. We've been looking forward to this. I am happy to say it's 12:49 for our 12:50 agenda item. So, with that, I'll turn to the director's office to take it from here. Thank you.
Hey there, thank you so much for having us here today. Just for the record, I'm Debbie Colbert and I'm the Deputy Director for Fish and Wildlife Programs at ODFW. We really appreciate the chance to come and talk to you about our priorities today. And if you don't already know it, this funding is a big deal to us as an agency. And we see ourselves as a member of a team with the committee for the long term. And that's why for today's discussion, I've included a whole bunch of really smart people with me. I want to take a minute to let them introduce themselves. So let's see, why don't we just go in order of what we're going to do our slides in. So maybe start with Tom Stahl.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Stahl. I'm the Conservation and Recovery Program Manager in Fish Division.
Adrian.
Good afternoon. I am Adrienne Averett, Interdivisional Beaver Coordinator.
Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily Van Wyk. I'm our Acting Conservation Strategy Coordinator in Wildlife Division.
And Sean, could you also introduce yourself?
Sorry, yeah, you caught me by surprise there. Hey everyone, Sean Clements in Fish Division here.
And then I also wanted to just note and have Spencer introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Spencer Swaski, hydrologist in the water program within the Habitat Division.
So we really don't have a lot of slides for you today. We wanted to kind of make this more of a conversation with all of you. Oh, thank you. Perfect. So, and we were asked to kind of talk about ODFW's priorities, but I have a hard time coloring within the lines. So we took a little bit of a different tact and kind of had this conversation around our hopes and dreams kind of thing. And a lot of times saying, hey, if I could wave a wand, and like, this is what I would do. So that's really what we wanted to capture, is really some thinking at a high level, but I promise you, we will actually drill down and give some specific examples. But I wanted to start kind of bigger picture, kind of our priorities of thinking about kind of, how do we leverage this amazing grant program to benefit the species identified in the Habitat Conservation Plan. And I think as a starting place, and please interrupt, because again, we're looking for a conversation with all of you. I think as a starting place, we wanted to just kind of talk about, the fact that it's not a blank sheet of paper in terms of kind of knowing how we can best move the dial for conservation and recovery of these species using this grant funding. There have been decades of work done in Oregon. So, from our perspective, as we think about the go forward and kind of putting these dollars on the ground at a kind of very high level, we really are hoping that we can be leveraging what we know about limiting factors for these species, areas that we've identified for priority, to just really be strategic and think about how we can address bottlenecks for those species in the areas where we think we can have the greatest impact. So just really high level, kind of starting out, thinking about this great opportunity. So we can go to the next slide. And when I say, we don't have a blank sheet of paper, what I mean are just kind of all the things that are out there that we can be informed by as you make your grant award decisions. So there's like these overarching things that are kind of management strategies and places where we've identified known limiting factors. Those are recovery plans or Oregon conservation strategy. We then have kind of more detailed statewide framework where we've really done work prioritizing actions that address limiting factors. And good examples are our fish passage priority list, our beaver action plan, our recent work on cold water emphasis areas and refugia, and then also kind of what's coming is our aquatic habitat priority areas. So those are all things that we hope can be brought to bear on the grant making by the committee so that we get the biggest bang for our buck. And then that can be in many places that you're going to be making grants and awards. There's even finer scale plans at the watershed level, the Coho strategic action plans, the beaver emphasis areas that we've identified. And then again, soon in progress is our basin flow restoration priorities. So again, hopes and dreams that the committee will really be oriented toward thinking about kind of what do we already know and how are these awards really giving us the best conservation return on investment. Let's go ahead to the next one. So what do we want to move the dial on? And I don't think you'll be surprised to see that habitat is really, from our perspective, a foundation for these populations. And really, especially when we think about climate and climate resiliency for these species, we go back to our emphasis on habitat. That's everything from habitat protection, where do we preserve areas that are already providing a lot of function for healthy populations? Where do we want to restore habitat? In degraded areas, where might we manage for beaver modified habitat and the benefits that those provide? Where do we want to look for opportunities to cool rivers, increase stream flow? Where do we know we have connectivity barriers for these populations that we can address through fish passage? And that is not only for fish, but also the amphibians that are included in the habitat conservation plan. Where do we provide for habitat by addressing connectivity and also refugia? And then fish screens, where can we prevent mortality and ensure that we are getting the gains from other habitat work that we're doing through putting fish screens in places that make sense. Let's go to the next slide. Now, in addition to that, we do think that there are opportunities for direct species management. We're looking at places like the Coquille, and where can we really go hard on physical removal of species, invasive species, or where might we consider reintroduction of species into historical ranges? Now, I started by saying we know a lot, and our hope is that as you are making recommendations for funding, you can be informed by what we know, but we also know that there still are gaps, and we need to put that out there as something that the committee thinks about, and I would say especially for amphibians, as really just making sure we have the best information that's being brought to bear on kind of how we leverage these funds. So those are really high level thoughts, hopes and dreams, kind of how we would prioritize if we had a magic wand and could think about how to spend this money to really get the best conservation benefits. We wanted to kind of now drill down and kind of show a couple of examples of kind of what would that look like from our perspective. So I'm going to hand it off to Tom, and he's going to talk about some state focal watersheds.
Okay, thanks, Debbie. Next slide, please. Okay, like Debbie said, I'd like to drill down in the Umpqua and Rogue, which are two of our state focal watersheds. They are on the coast. They originate in the Cascades. They're the only coastal basins that do originate in the Cascades, so they have a pretty high diversity in terms of life history for salmonids. There are coho, spring and fall chinook, summer and winter steelhead, and cutthroat in both the Umpqua and the Rogue. And the Umpqua and the Rogue are also kind of at the front line for climate change. There are water quality issues, there are wildfires, there are varying degrees of ocean impacts for the anadromous fish that are moving out into the ocean from those different basins. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of opportunity to improve the resilience of the habitat in freshwater to support these life histories and these species into the future. Next slide, please. So for example, in the Umpqua, we'll drill down there a little bit more. We know that primary limiting factors across the basin are really a handful of things: water quality, namely stream temperature, water quantity, flow levels in the basin. There are identified issues around predation by non-native fish, such as smallmouth bass and possibly striped bass. There are also physical habitat issues in the basin, which really deal with the in-channel complexity of the stream, the amount of pools, large wood, meanders, things like that, as well as gravel. So these are the primary limiting factors. We know these because there have been a number of plans that encompass the Umpqua. And these include the Coast Coho Conservation Plan developed by the state in 2007, There was also a federal recovery plan that was adopted in 2016 to deal with coho, which are the only federally listed ESA species, salmonid, in the on the coast. We also have, for the other salmonids, the Coastal Multi-Species Plan, which was adopted in 2014, and more recently, an interim strategic action plan, really focusing on projects, has been developed, given the indication in NMFS's most recent 5-year status assessment that coho and the Umpqua are in need of improvement and for us to get to delisting. So these plans identify limiting factors and then some specific projects. And some of those projects are listed here. There's a Highland Ditch and Irrigation System project that's been identified, which involves dam removal and modernization of irrigation equipment to restore in-stream flows and water quality. There are a number of culvert replacement projects that have been identified through geospatial analysis that will provide access to cooler, cleaner water for these migratory species. There are also flow restoration activities, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And we also beaver dam analog placements and encouragement of beaver pools will help get at the physical habitat needs in the basin. I would also like to point out before we move on that there are also co-benefits likely for these projects that will benefit the salmonids with other species such as salamanders and frogs, and vice versa. Projects that benefit salamanders and frogs will also potentially have the benefits for the salmonids as well. So it looks like there's a question. So before we move on, do we want to take that?
Hey. Yeah, Debbie encouraged it, so I'm getting in. Tom, the question I have for you is twofold. The one, it's interesting that you highlight the Umpqua as a state focal watershed. It certainly has been for the industry too. I think the biggest annual fundraiser for conservation is in the Umpqua, and just massive amounts funded. And then that your picture shows a burned riparian area is also prescient. But the question I have for you is, you talk about predation up here, which I agree is actually a big limiting factor in the introduction of these invasives. When you talk about bass and their impacts on these species, is there any way to get at that? Is there any means of addressing those species conflicts?
In terms of managing them or understanding the problem, or both?
No, yeah, well, I think we understand the problem, but to the degree that predation is a problem, how do you address it?
That's an excellent question. We've done things like remove limits along the coast on bass. That may not have a huge impact, but it encourages some potential benefits for salmonids. We're doing bass removal projects in the Coquille right now, and looking to see the impacts of that. There are also there's a lot of talk at least the Western States level about some new techniques in terms of genetic techniques that help reduce the bass population by putting more males out there, so there are fewer reproducing individuals. So there's a number of things that we can try. I totally agree. It's a big problem, hard to get at, but one that we have the potential to look at some tools and see what benefit we might have, even if it's just in some localized areas that are pretty important.
I think you can expect an application for PFA mitigation dollars for an Umpqua bass fishing tournament.
So Heath, if I could just add, we were really pleased. I don't want to get too much in the details, but we were really pleased to work with Senator Brock Smith in the 23 session. And we were able to get more authority to remove non-invasive species and not run up against our waste of game species. So right now, a lot of times when we do derbies, you have to use everything that you would catch because you can't waste game species. We got some really specific authority that the department can authorize the removal. And so we could do more of those kinds of derbies and removal efforts moving forward. So
Fabulous. Very good. Thank you.
Hey, could I just add one more thing to what Tom was saying? I think the spread of bass as streams warm is one of the things that gives several of us shivers when we think about the impacts that will have on native fish species, and you're seeing it in the coquille. Directed removals like we're doing in the coquille with the tribe there can work if you're in a small area and you have access, and we're seeing some success there in reducing the population. You're never going to eliminate it, but you can suppress it. Problem there is that you have to do it in perpetuity, which is tough to do. That's where the YY stuff that Tom was talking about, the Western Consortium, can really help, because that is a thing where we're seeing success with brook trout and driving populations to extinction. That's something we're following up on. But then the habitat piece is one that I want to add. What's really becoming an issue is that because these streams are warming earlier, the bass becoming more active earlier, and they're overlapping with the outmigration of the juveniles. And so by taking actions about shading streams, flow restoration so you can cool it down, all those kind of things can help push that window back further and get them out of that window when they're out migrating out. And even a degree or two can help there. So a lot of stuff we can do on the habitat side can also make a difference here.
Yeah, thanks for adding that one, Sean. That's a good one. And with that, I think next slide, over to Spencer.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to pivot slightly and talk about a specific restoration action, namely stream flow restoration. I'm also going to stick with the focal watersheds of the Umpqua and the Rogue. So both of these broader watersheds are in certain locations heavily impacted by the combined impacts of irrigation withdrawals in the summertime combined with climate change impacts. So this in general results in decreased in-stream flows, decreased available in-stream habitat, and also resulting in increased water temperatures, oftentimes above lethal limits for some of the HCV covered species. So flow restoration through partnerships with individual irrigators or irrigation districts has the real potential to increase in-stream habitat during the summer months, reducing water temperatures, as well as just allowing for improved connectivity and general available in-stream habitat. The map on the right is an illustration of a draft prioritization of subwatersheds within the Umpqua and the Rogue basins. This is based on a comparison of current summer stream flows relative to historical or expected natural conditions, combined with species distribution data, as well as climate change predictions. The hope here is to focus on the ground efforts to develop streamflow restoration programs and projects in these focal watersheds, which we believe will have the greatest long-term benefit on the most species. And I'll just add that there's currently a relatively limited amount of funding available for flow restoration work, particularly on the west side of the state, and any additional funds that could be focused towards that through this grant process would be hugely beneficial to the flow restoration practitioners on the west side, and in particular on the Umpqua and the Rogue, where flow restoration efforts are really ramping up. And
so
with that, we can move to the next slide.
Yeah,
Sorry,
so that
Debbie.
kind of just, again, that's just one way that we can kind of like demonstrate this idea of kind of what do we know, where can we make a big difference, what kinds of activities. So next we want to have Adrian kind of fill you in on our beaver emphasis areas, which we developed as part of our beaver action plan. Sorry, Bob, you had a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. I'm not seeing really pop up in any of the slides so far. And I know the state's done a ton of work on fish passage over the last 20 years, especially connected to the Oregon plan. How do you see it ranking in terms of these other issues? I mean, I'm hearing obviously climate change and water issues, water supply issues, flow issues are critical identified need. But I'm wondering about passage and how it fits.
Well, I think it absolutely is another priority, and kind of the way that I think about all of this kind of fitting together is you imagine taking that flow restoration priorities map, and you look at some of the most critical passage projects, and you think about kind of the overlay of where are we providing more flow and where are we trying to address passage in conjunction with that. So again, being very strategic with the dollars. I don't know if Sean has anything to add on that front.
Yeah, I think it comes into like when we're looking at priority geographies like the Rogue and Umpqua, then you can start to look in those basins and say, what are the limiting factors in the sub-basins that need to be addressed? And in some cases, it's a combination of those things like flow and passage and predators, or it might be just one or the other. And there's various tools that we have that can help you identify what those limiting factors and actions might be. And Bob, you're familiar with those strategic action plans. That's kind of exactly what they do, right? Is take that really fine scale look at a place and say, what is the priority across limiting factors and where do we need to do the work? Fish passage is priority in a lot of places, but it's also varies as to whether it's the highest priority. And that's just, you have to take it case by case. And if you're working in a particular geography, then there are tools available to help the board prioritize what and where should happen.
That's great. I will just say that, you know, as this program evolves, I'm certainly be helpful for the ODF and W biologists who are funded by PFA money to be aware of those tools so that they can work with grant applicants to help them think about putting their proposals in a way that are well-founded on priorities that are rooted in science or other analytical methods. So just
absolutely.
A comment. Thanks.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. That is, it's a perfect role for those biologists to be playing on the ground. So we're going to now kind of give you a little bit of a different example that really comes from our Beaver Action Plan. Adrienne.
Hello, everyone. So why am I talking to you about beaver today when it is not an HCP species? And the core reason is because beaver are another tool in our prioritization toolbox that we can use to address limiting factors for HCP species. So ODFW released its 3-year Beaver Modified Landscapes Action Plan this past June, as Debbie mentioned, and you have a link to that plan in the agenda that Andy shared with everyone. And the Beaver Action Plan outlines the department's goals for creating tools and shared information to better understand current beaver distribution and support the work of our partners in scaling up beaver modified landscape restoration in Oregon. And the 10 beaver emphasis areas that you see on this map are the core watershed focal areas for the work that the department is going to engage on with its partners over the coming years. It's important to note that the action plan and its beaver emphasis areas really coalesce and build upon beaver-related priorities that are already outlined in Oregon's conservation strategy, native fish conservation and recovery plans, as Tom mentioned, and actions outlined in the private forest accord. For example, beaver dams and their pools can provide ecological benefits to Oregon private forest accord HCP species across their life cycle to help address the limiting factors of increased stream temperature, decreased in-stream flows, decreased habitat complexity and connectivity for Oregon's salmon, steelhead, bull trout, and mountain whitefish populations. And so beaver related projects that would be a good fit for PFA grant funding include a portfolio of options that partners can tailor to the site-specific limiting factors for HCP species. First, projects such as increasing beaver habitat to support their occupancy on the landscape may include riparian restoration projects such as conservation easements, exclusion fencing, planting diverse woody and herbaceous vegetation, and managing invasive plant species to increase food resources for beaver, while also improving riparian habitat conditions for HCP fish species and co-occurring Oregon conservation strategy species such as amphibians, birds, mammals, reptiles, and invertebrates. Second, increasing beaver modified habitat can occur through projects that protect existing beaver pools and wetland habitats or apply beaver mimicry techniques, such as using low-tech process-based restoration strategies, beaver dam analogs, as Tom mentioned, post-assisted log structures or small wood structures, also coupled with the riparian treatments I mentioned before and the in-stream flow restoration activities, as Spencer mentioned, to really help restore floodplain riparian wetland function, off-channel specialized habitats, and water quality conditions, such as summer and winter rearing space, food, overhead wood cover to hide from predators, and cold water refugia, conditions that are critical for juvenile fish survival. And I mention this because a lack of sufficient juvenile habitat is a primary freshwater life cycle pinch point for most of Oregon's ESA listed salmon and steelhead populations that are included on your HCP species list. Third, projects can also apply beaver coexistence strategies. These types of projects might be beaver exclusion devices, pond levelers, and tree protection, either through caging or gridded paint, applying gridded paint to reduce beaver damage to infrastructure while maintaining beaver and their dams and pools on the landscape. And finally, as others have mentioned, we still have data gaps, even about beaver in Oregon. So beaver activity surveys and effectiveness monitoring can provide information on where we have beaver on the landscape, how beaver are using available habitat, the effectiveness or return on ecological investment of the beaver modified habitat projects that partners implement, and strategically guide future beaver-related work to address HCP species limiting factors. And with that, I will pass it on to Emily so she can tell us a little bit about amphibians and their role.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Adrian. Sorry, a little bit excited today. So with that, I will transition us to those 5 covered amphibian species, and hopefully we'll all strap in for a lot of information about amphibians packed in as fast as I can. So while the covered amphibian species have a lot of shared needs with fish, they're different, and they come with their own set of complexities, including needs in both terrestrial and aquatic habitats. And I'm going to try and keep this broad, so we're in a really different position with amphibians. We have so little information on these species, including even just basic distribution. So each of the 5 covered species is a stream obligate. They're dependent on headwater streams for reproduction and larval rearing. And at watershed scales, these stream-dwelling amphibians are oftentimes found much higher up in the stream network than many of the fish species that we're talking about here today. There's some overlap, but these amphibians are oftentimes found in non-fish bearing streams as well. Each of them uses habitats with cool, clear water and complex substrates, including high gradient streams and seeps. Though torrent salamanders, including the 2 that are covered here, can occur in intermittent or ephemeral headwater streams, where giant salamanders and tailed frogs use a broader set of stream habitats, can be in 1st to 5th order perennial streams. And then after metamorphosis, each of these species can be found using terrestrial habitats. So all of that is to say that they need habitat connectivity, both in terrestrial and aquatic habitats. Each of them can disperse over land rather than through the stream network. Some of them are pointedly trying to avoid fish-bearing reaches, and they can disperse hundreds of meters into the uplands. They require connectivity among those neighboring drainages, in particular Connectivity of their forested habitat across headwater ridgelines can be really important for dispersal and then metapopulation connectivity. So not only are we thinking about connectivity between different reaches of the same stream, but we're talking about one stream over a ridge to a whole nother one. 4 of the 5 of these HCP covered amphibians are Oregon Conservation Strategy species, and they're state sensitive here in Oregon. So the Oregon Conservation Strategy is, again, our state wildlife action plan, and it outlines data gaps, special needs, limiting factors, and recommended conservation actions for each of these species. This is a really great resource to help guide identification of projects that would really best benefit them. Threats for each of the 5 of these species are broadly similar. So they're sensitive to things like changes in stream flow, water temperature, and temperature increases in terrestrial habitat. They're also impacted by increase in siltation. They also have fairly limited dispersal capabilities, and they're vulnerable to desiccation. So as they're moving over land, they're really vulnerable to drying out. Another big threat I will keep harping on is the lack of information on these species. So stream-dwelling amphibian species, including all of the covered species here, are still impacted by a dearth of even basic ecological information. There's extremely limited information available describing distribution, occupancy, and sensitivity to disturbance. Addressing those data deficiencies for these species is really critical in ensuring that resources are allocated in a way that can best support efficient, effective, long-term conservation of these amphibians. Can we go to the next one, please? So again, these amphibians are oftentimes higher up in the stream network than many of the fish species we're talking about within the PFA. So what this means is that as we think about potential projects for this fund, protections and management that are focused on fish aren't always an effective umbrella to protect stream-dwelling amphibians. However, projects focused on protecting habitat for the amphibians can have a profound positive downstream effect to a broad suite of other species. There are opportunities for fish-focused project proposals to incorporate considerations for amphibians for more holistic conservation benefits, as Tom had outlined. So there's a lot of overlap, but it's not a perfect umbrella. So it's important to consider each of those groups separately, as well as how we can combine those efforts. So as we think about that, the types of projects that I think about that could be a good fit for PFA funding to advance the conservation of these amphibian species include things that couple on-the-ground habitat restoration and protection with a survey and monitoring component. So examples of that would be things like a proposal that incorporates an assessment of responses of HCP amphibians, including abundance or survival or recruitment to treatment types like slope retention or updated culvert design or road restoration. By incorporating monitoring and survey into those efforts, we can inform long-term success of investment of PFA funds by closing those critical data gaps for those species that are currently precluding effective targeted conservation action. Focal areas that are most suitable for the covered amphibian species include headwater and associated terrestrial habitat protection and restoration, and proposals that'll help maintain cold water habitats and limit sedimentation, especially higher up in the stream network. Wherever possible, projects, including those that aren't amphibian focused, in my mind should incorporate a robust effectiveness monitoring component. So in light of limited available information, each project funded presents an opportunity to learn more about how to conduct needed on-the-ground restoration in a way that can support long-term conservation of these species. And then the information gathered through those processes can then be used to develop tools, including things like best management practices for covered amphibian species, which we currently really don't have, that can guide successful future implementation and inform adaptive management. And again, integrating information gathered in those projects will support long-term success of PFA funding investments. We're also interested in projects that help to conserve, protect, or identify habitat refugia and linkage areas for headwater ecosystems. Each of these covered amphibian species is really vulnerable to impacts from climate change, facing threats in the aquatic systems as well as in terrestrial systems. So it's important to identify and protect refugia in light of an uncertain future. Connectivity within and among drainages is critical to maintaining those population structures. And so mapping projects that can help us identify spatial conservation prioritization. Where do you want to go? We need those resources. Instead of choosing a headwater on the map, we need to understand which ones we should prioritize first. We don't currently have that information. Focused conservation efforts on habitat refugia will provide long-term benefits for these species. and something that I hope we can focus on. So the last thing I want to emphasize for all of us is really that PFA funding for these species is a game changer. So this is not a group of species with a long history of focused investment, as evidenced by how little we know about them. So this is a really exciting opportunity, and I hope you guys can help us secure their long-term conservation through this effort. So I think I'm handing it back to Sarah to wrap us up.
Thanks, Emily. Andrew has a question.
Yeah, Emily, does the department have a plan for trying to fill the significant data gaps that exist around amphibians?
Yeah, so I mentioned briefly the Oregon Conservation Strategy, and the reason I glossed over it so quickly is I think it was Chris in the last month gave a little bit of an overview of the Oregon Conservation Strategy. So that's our State Wildlife Action Plan, and that provides a suite of information for each of these species. So for the 5 our Oregon Conservation Strategy species, and within that document, we identify data gaps, we identify the needs, and how we can start approaching that. This is something that we don't have projects lined up to move forward on. There are a lot of species identified within the Oregon Conservation Strategy. There's 109 wildlife species, so amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles. And this is a small portion of them. So we're not currently moving towards filling those data gaps. We've identified them, and we're trying to use the strategy, the Oregon Conservation Strategy, as a tool to support all of our partners in moving towards those shared conservation goals. So instead of the department answering the questions, we're saying these are our conservation goals. How can we get there? Does that help?
Looks like you're muted, Andrew.
Yeah, I would just encourage the department and us as well, given that there's so much more information about the fish species, and likely the primary objective of a lot of proposals is going to be around fish species, to try to see what we can learn around the impacts on amphibians as we do this, because it just feels like they're going to be secondary in terms of not the species being secondary, but in terms of the proposals. The primary objective is going to be around fisheries, would be my guess. So just to see what we can learn in this process.
And then Bob.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that another challenge here is there's not a well-developed set of partners in the NGO community to do amphibian projects like there is in the fish community already. So I think longer term, broadly speaking, there's a challenge here to try to cultivate partners outside of the agencies who can help identify, implement, advocate for, and move these projects forward. Thanks.
So Sarah, you want to kind of bring us home?
Yes, thank you. I'm just need to cultivate partners. I just had to get that down because I agree with that wholeheartedly. Right. So from February to today, we're so close. We have done so much work with this committee to be close to launching our first solicitation. We're at this great place where we can actually have a sort of a fun tour of the state and of the species from ODFW in terms of all the good work that could be done. So it feels very exciting to be at this point where we can start to truly contemplate what we're going to fund. So, you know, we're off to a great start. There's a lot to choose from. I think when prospective applicants start to dig into the various plans and frameworks that we've talked about in this presentation, they're going to find that there really is a lot of work that has to be done, and a lot of it that's going to align with the goals of this program and that can benefit the PFA covered species. And I think we have an opportunity with PFA to really move the dial, as Debbie said, in a very positive direction. And so we invite applicants and the committee to really think big with these PFA projects. Think landscape scale, think multiple species, and co-benefits, as we were just talking about, a fish project that also surveys and monitors for amphibians, for example. And think also about leveraging partnerships and those federal funding opportunities that are really kind of once in a lifetime, and we're in the midst of that at the moment. All that said, I think we know that PFA is not going to be perfect right out of the gate. Bob was speaking to that earlier today, and I think it's worth reminding ourselves of that repeatedly as we kind of get started here. We're going to continue to learn and adapt. I think you can count on ODFW staff being with you every step along the way as we learn and adapt this program. Bob mentioned the PFA stream biologists. Absolutely. They're a resource to help inform applicants. They're going to be a resource to the committee on the review teams. And beyond just the stream biologists, our district fish and wildlife staff, our division folks that you heard from today are all available to you all as technical assistants, and also available to applicants as, you know, potential partners on projects. In the longer term, I think we're on track to be broad with this first solicitation. We've talked about that before, that we know we don't really know. We're sort of curious to see what comes in this first round, right? But sooner than later, we may want to consider some more focused investments. You heard Tom and Spencer talking about the Umpqua and the Rogue. Those are places that ODFW is really focusing its investments and channeling a lot of federal infrastructure dollars into those geographies. So we may get to a point with PFA where we want to consider some more focused work, either topically or geographically. And, you know, ODFW is also going to continue to bring forward the new information that was referenced earlier, some of the data products and models that can continue to help inform priorities. And so we're happy to come back and present to the committee on those as they get finalized. Things like the aquatic habitat restoration priorities, the cold water refugia models, and other decision support systems as they come online. And I just wanted to circle back to one other topic that Andrew brought it up, and I think Bob mentioned it as well. And there are some challenges that I think PFA can help with that are worthy projects to consider, and that is filling data and information gaps, especially for our amphibians, but also building that capacity within partners in order to be able to do some of this work on the ground. There may be some need to help bolster capacity, i.e., staff needed to implement projects, or if there's still engineering and design work, project management, water specialists. There just may need to be some consideration of helping fund capacity in order to get some of this work lifted. So those were just kind of some closing thoughts as we translate the priorities that you heard about into the actual grant making. And I think that just about rounds us out. I see, Andrew, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, Sarah, I'm glad you ended on the capacity point. I was actually going to ask the question of you or Debbie about the extent to which, and part of this was prompted by Spencer's presentation about flow and the Umpqua. I actually texted Kristen. I was like, are you guys doing flow projects in the Umpqua? And she said, not at this point. So I was like, well, who's doing flow restoration in the Umpqua then? And the question is, to what extent have you all, through this program or other funding or other priorities that the agency has, are you communicating and collaborating with OWEB about supporting the capacity that's needed to really get these more difficult types of restoration actions done?
I can take a crack,
go ahead.
Sarah. Just it is evolving, Andrew. So, when we talk about the Umpqua and the Rogue, that was really kind of an area when the IIJA money rolled out a couple of years ago. We decided as an agency that we were going to go hard, that we were going to do everything we could to get as much of that money for Oregon, and we didn't care who got it. But we also recognized that we needed to be strategic in terms of we couldn't work everywhere. So we front loaded a lot of that at just projects because that's what they would fund. And now, we've got this new information and I think we're evolving into more of a capacity question to continue that work. I think there's opportunities. We just heard about, and I can't remember if it was Fish and Wildlife or NOAA just kind of did a big announcement in terms of workforce development. And I know that there's going to be a number of watershed councils that will put in to kind of develop some capacity, and we're going to be supporting them with those applications. So, I think it's evolving, and I think we're also just kind of like running up against those walls. So it is time. It's time for us to kind of collectively think about how we address it.
Well, I mean, we're going to potentially see that in the responses we get to the first solicitation, like who's actually bringing proposals forward and where are there gaps in terms of groups that are capable of addressing the limiting factors that you all just presented really clearly in places like the Umpqua or the Rogue.
Mark Stern.
Looks like
Mark Stern. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious in terms of the presentation, if Tom, Spencer, Adrian, Emily, and others, if you all have specific projects you envision bringing forward in this first round of grants, because obviously the department's thought about this quite a bit. It seems like all of you would be well positioned to know what's ripe and ready to go. So I'm wondering if you're thinking about projects in this first go around.
I guess from the water program's perspective, we typically help prioritize where potential restoration projects would occur, but don't actually oversee or implement the project. So we would work with groups like TU and Kristen to help implement on the ground. We do have, or we will have, a new flow restoration coordinator, I believe, in the water program, which will help with a little bit more of the on the ground implementation. But to date, we've been more of a high level prioritization focus than actual on the ground implementation.
Yeah, I mean, Spencer, I might be wrong on this, but I might have been the last guy who tried to shake the trees in the Umpqua for water deals, and that was a long time ago. So we're going to have to identify who those actors are that are going to do that if you're not going to be doing it, and I don't expect that you should be doing it.
Heath, please.
John, you mentioned freshwater habitat investments. I think that a big piece of the work we did in the private forest accord was freshwater habitat investments. Do you think that the new stream buffers we adopted are going to be responsive to the needs that you identified? And is there ever a point at which the buffers are large enough?
Sorry, was that to me? I missed this stuff. Okay.
Yes.
I thought it was. I better pay attention here. Yeah, I think the changes you all made in the PFA are certainly going to be beneficial to the covered species, and it's a big step forward. But that's not to say that there are other impacts that haven't occurred out there that can be remedied through restoration, right? And it may not necessarily be on forest lands. It could be down low, could be on other types of land ownerships. So I think we got to look in each basin and see where we're seeing these particular bottlenecks. And like I said, it may be on forest land, it may not be, but addressing those bottlenecks and kind of, yeah, I guess that's it really.
Thanks for that.
Bob, if I could just kind of circle back to Mark's question. You kind of heard some crickets from us on that, because I honestly, I don't think that we've thought about kind of what our role is to drumming up applications that fit our priorities. But it is an excellent question. And I think that's something that we'll take back and say, how do we help point, hey, opportunity and work with those groups and help to bring some of the things that we would hope would be high priorities. So I appreciate that question, and we'll do some thinking about that.
Yeah, I think part of it is that we've been so busy working with partners on the federal side to put applications in for federal funding. That we have a lot of things ready to go, but have to strategize about how we cover our bases on, well, if we don't get federal funding, is this fund another source, or you don't want to end up with both, obviously. But I think we'll have to have more internal conversation on that. And then to the capacity question, that's something we've been beating the drum on for a year or two now, ever since IAJ came out, and we knew this was going to be a problem. We've been talking to the congressional delegation back in DC about all the federal grants and how they don't necessarily include capacity. And then that's why this particular fund source is so unique, and it has a little bit more flexibility and latitude in what you all could fund to address some of the bottlenecks, and then we can leverage other fund sources. But in particular, flow restoration is one we've struggled with, where you need to build a ground game in a lot of these places so that you can get projects generated, and we just don't have that. But it's going to be the key limiting factor in a lot of places going forward.
Emily?
I was just gonna answer Mark's question. You got crickets for me because I was waiting for somebody else to go first, and then we kept going too fast.
That's amazing.
I'm seeing some frozen folks there.
I'm still here, Bob, and I have to apologize. When it froze earlier, I thought folks were done. Sorry to interject.
Sorry about that. I'm in the office, but sometimes our office Wi-Fi when we're in this room is a little bit questionable, so I'll try that again.
Thank you.
From the amphibian side of things, we have been thinking about it. There are a couple of projects that I'm hoping to see from partners come forward. We've been talking for quite some time because this is, again, an unprecedented opportunity. One of the challenges that we're looking at is that the stated grant priorities for this first round aren't towards the end of the spectrum of data gathering. And I really do think for amphibians, we still need some of that basic information to make sure that the work that we're doing is effective, it's focused, it's going to the right places. And so that's the hesitation we have. We still need that information. And there are focused ways we'd like to collect that information and then immediately step from that. It's the on the ground component that has been a little bit challenging. So you will see some that we've been talking about in advance, hopefully come forward. And I'm hoping there might be some flexibility in incorporating that data gathering component to make sure that we're doing good work for these covered species.
Thank you, Emily. I've got Andrew Perkey, Chad Washington, and then Kristen Rivard.
Yeah, Debbie, I'm glad to hear you say that you think you ought to be strategizing about the role the department plays itself, and then also in terms of encouraging partners around the objectives that you've identified. And you and Spencer may recall that through the Columbia Basin Water Program, very narrowly to the field of, or the space of flow, although Sean, you emphasize that flow is clearly a big issue. You know, Washington State, and granted, ecology's got a lot of money, but you'll remember Jonathan Core was their guy who was constantly working with the NGOs like TU and others to develop transactions and projects. And so you might want to just, Debbie, reach across the state line just to see what are opportunities for the department to work with TU and the Rogue to really advance these things, or new partners, whether they be watershed councils or soil water conservation districts, and not just in the flow space. I'm just bringing that up, obviously, since that's the place I'm most familiar with, but in other spaces as well.
Chad, please.
Yeah, Sean, I was wondering if you've done much work with ODOT when you're looking at those bottlenecks. And, you know, has there been any discussion with ODOT that maybe we could help fund some, you know, fish passage barriers down lower in the system? Oftentimes we do all this great work on the timberlands higher in the system, and it can't be taken advantage of by the species because of these county or state highway fish passage issues. Do you have experience working with ODOT on those?
Yeah, we're a pretty close partner with ODOT. So we have our CRPA program, culvert replacement programmatic, whereby they contribute funds for mitigation there and upgrade culverts over time. So there's that program, and there's two staff here that liaise with ODOT on that. And then separately, the nationwide DOT got several $1 billion in the IIJA that they just started dispersing, and Craig Smith, our policy analyst in the Fish Division, put together a $60 million proposal for Oregon with ODOT, and that's been funded over 3 years. So I think we, the state, are getting $19 million in this next year, and then another 20 in each subsequent year to implement that. So there's going to be a lot of work going on with ODOT on culverts and bridge replacements over the next few years, but there's a lot to do there as well. So I think there's always room to work with ODOT. They have a large list that they've prioritized, and we help them prioritize. And I think it's really fitting into our fish passage prioritization scheme and going after the highest priority ones.
Very good, because to Debbie's point, I do think that the agency would be well suited to administer some of these grants, and working with partners like ODOT and TU. A partner can be anybody. And so I would encourage you to also look to other agencies as partners, as well as conservation organizations.
Yeah, that's a good point. And when we did talk about capacity, just have to recognize that the department also has its own capacity issues, and we've really stretched our contracting division and administration side and trying to get money out there and administer grants ourselves, and it's been an issue for us as well.
Kristen, please.
Yeah, so first, Chad, one other piece of that is definitely counties. The first wave of federal highways funding that came in, some did go to Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, but a number of the awards also went to counties to address county road, culvert, fish passage issues, as well as related infrastructure needs. So we should definitely be thinking about the counties as partners as well. But the other point I wanted to make is that I think the authors envisioned, at least from my perspective, a really important feedback loop between the adaptive management program that was developed under the PFA and the mitigation committee. And so to the extent that there remain questions about particularly amphibians and what work can we best do to support recovery and sustainability of our amphibian populations that are covered under the PFA, I think there's a really important loop between adaptive management, looking at what's working, are we hitting the goals that we need, and then what additional investments through the mitigation committee could be most helpful. And then alongside that, I know the authors also recognized some of these capacity constraints, and were particularly concerned that we might get a number of applications in one project category or a limited number of geographies, but might not receive any applications from another geography that we know is a high priority for some of the covered species. And in that case, our hope was that we could invest in capacity either through the agency or through standing up other partners or investing in watershed councils, whatever that looks like, to get that capacity to build up proposals where we're seeing kind of a geographic discrepancy between the impacts that we're trying to cover through the mitigation program and what's sort of more organically coming up. And then the final piece of that is I think the new stream restoration biologists that are a part of the PFA package will also play a really important role in identifying some of those project opportunities and either being able to push those forward from the agency or identify partners that would be well suited to make those proposals. So I hope that there's a pretty complete package there to try to wrestle these things down. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks, Kristen. I'm going to call on myself briefly, just reiterate what Kristen said. I believe the Private Forest Accord report specifically calls out amphibians as an early research area for the Adaptive Management Committee, and they've got resources out there. I think that's supposed to be an early focus, and that, of course, was a recognition about the lack of information, just the lack of data and understanding of those species. What I want to say, though, is I think there's a good opportunity for us to develop I mentioned earlier the biologists being helpful, but also put together a kind of resource page or information on the web that directs applicants to these variety of plans that ODF&W has already, to analytical tools that are out there, to things like the 5-year status reviews that help direct restoration activities and recovery activities. Anyway, I guess it's clear there's been a ton of work done about how to help a lot of these species, and we need to make it as easy as we can for applicants to draw on those resources so that they're bringing forward projects that are strongly rooted in the kind of planning that's been developed already. So that's all for me, and we'll go to Chad. Well, actually, a quick check-in with Andy. Andy, I see we've got the ODF&W 3-year action plan. That is a separate agenda item, or did we cover that? We did cover that. Okay.
That was covered, correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's just an oversight in the agenda there to have that as a separate item, number 7. So we do have some more time. Let's go ahead with some more questions here. I've got Heath next, please.
Oh, goodness. I was, Kristen, when you and I had talked about this before, I seem to recall you expressing some skepticism about our ability to specifically recruit projects in priority areas. And maybe I misremember. I wondered if it might be helpful in light of this conversation to publish like point advantages, like to say that in this round of applications that we're going to prioritize investments in certain areas by virtue of, elevating their point total or their, the merits of their application in the context of the process. I don't know where that would fit or how per se, but in light of this conversation, it occurred to me that maybe Andy and Sarah could help us grapple with that concept, where to the degree that we want to begin shaping these investments, maybe it's not appropriate to wait for the applications to come to us. Maybe we should try and advertise and say, here's where we would like to invest.
Thank you for that, Heath. Which gets at that question, just going forward, if we're going to have a priority, how do we implement that? Or how do we reflect that in the process somehow? Chad, please.
I would just like to say, I appreciate Kristen's comments around the priority areas. And if I remember correctly, Bob, when we were delivering testimony to the commission, one of the commissioners mentioned she really didn't want to see the monies going to the same kind of echo chambers or the same players. And it sounded more of like an equity issue, making sure that the monies are available to maybe groups that haven't been funded in the past. And I think that also gets to this priority area issue, is not just funneling the money to the same type of projects in the same areas to the same organizations that receive, most of the money. And so your point is well taken, Kristen, and it was a concern from the commission as well, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, we did hear that from the commission, and I think it was in a sort of equity lens, making sure that there was broad opportunity and that folks were aware of the opportunity of this fund out there. And there may be a need for us going forward to try to cultivate capacity, which was mentioned, I think, in a specific area, which might be geographic, or it might be on a topic or a particular species where it would be helpful to have more partners. Andrew.
Yeah, I like this conversation, Heath. I like what you put forward. I'm wondering, though, in this first round, if we almost cast a wide net just to get an assessment of the field and what it looks like and where are the gaps, both substantively and in terms of the organizations that put, and geographically that the projects come from.
Agreed. I literally have no idea what to expect.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we had 4 applications, right? I have no idea.
Well, we could start one of those, guess the number of applications thing kind of between everybody and just see who gets the closest. Starbucks coffee reward or something. I don't know, Mr. Chair, you'll have to think about that.
Okay, I will think about that. How we can start a betting pool of some sort. I know there are good online mechanisms to facilitate that as well. Any other comments or questions on for ODF&W, or things that any of the ODF&W staff would like to add? And certainly, as our ex officio members know, they're always welcome to join in. Okay, well, hearing nothing, I want to express my my gratitude for your time and energy you put into this and all these projects that you've got. I appreciated the presentation today, and obviously this is a continuing conversation with all of you. So I think we'll be visiting with you individually, it may be, but also be all together again here to do a check-in, which I assume would be probably at least annual in nature for us to have a visit about. Here's, where we've given away the money. What are we learning that's new? Are there new opportunities to be aware of? Or obviously you can work through the chair or through Sarah and Andy can bring forward particular topics that you think it's helpful to bring to us if they're timely.
And we would just reiterate that we're at your disposal. Like, we are so invested in the work of this committee, and no pressure, but we really see this as being a game changer, and like we've been saying, kind of moving the dial in some key areas. So honestly, you don't even need to hesitate, and we'll be there to support you in anything you need.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Debbie. Heath, and then Chad, if there are any other closing comments too. Heath, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, this was another one of those presentations, which is great, Debbie. Thank you. It was good. All of this was excellent. It was pretty high level, yeah, salmon need cold, clear water, and amphibians need more. But the question for me has always been kind of, where's the specific opportunities? And, Bob, I suppose I would be interested someday in a presentation. I know that the Wild Salmon Center has produced your business plans with, identifying kind of priority areas and even priority projects, like some specifics. I don't know. I really struggle with the vision of how this is going to play out. And maybe we're going to have 1 million applications and we're going to be blessed by an opportunity to select from among them. But it does occur to me that, if we had those kinds of resources, kind of vetting them and making them available to the public might also be useful. And I would be interested in learning more about what those resources are, where organizations have done modeling about the biggest bang for the buck in terms of, these species investments, and, how we could align our investments with that. I like the overarching messages, but I just know, you guys, the conservation community lately has been led by some organizations that have been really smart about prioritizing and identifying places for investment and how to maximize your return on investment. And I'd really like to see some of that folded into this body. I don't know how to do that, but I sure would rather not reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Heath, and I certainly think we could do some presentations on how you draw down from the high level limiting factor to the specific location for prioritization. So let's definitely put that on the calendar.
Yes. And Heath, we were kind of trying to do that for you in some of our examples, where we kind of started at those high level plans, and then we went down and we kind of mined those plans deeper and tried to say, and here's 3 projects: this irrigation district, this area for flow restoration. So that's exactly what we're hoping the committee will do, is kind of use those things that we already know, and we can work with Andy to make sure that we're really highlighting all of those resources for applicants.
Right. And for the PFA mitigation committee members.
That's right. And I think what Heath's really getting at too is what's the method? You know, how do you determine that that particular project is the one where the value? Obviously, there'll be an element of opportunism, probably oftentimes, because you don't get to choose everywhere you want to operate. But given that, you know, how else do we tear down? Chad, please.
Yeah, I just want to offer some closing comments. And one, thank you, Debbie, for presenting with all of your staff. That was really informative. Second, you know, thank you, Andy and Sarah, for all the work that you're doing behind the scenes. But really, I just want to take a minute to recognize Bob and to thank him for all of his hard work. To chair this committee from inception has been a big body of work, and I don't want that to go unrecognized. So, Bob, thank you for all that you've done for this.
Well, thank you, Chad. I will note we've got another agenda item ahead on the committee membership, so we can touch that there, but I appreciate that and thank you. Any other comments or wrap up on with ODFW and the priorities here from committee? Or Sarah, did you want to?
Just as you're all mentioning, wanting to see like a resource page or a list of resources, we are so close to having an updated website for the program. And we're even going to have our own like vanity URL. I think it's going to be pfagrants.com. And so it'll be a way for people to get to it really quickly. And we are building a resources page that will have all those 5-year plans, all of the frameworks that we talked about, and we would be happy to host additional kind of drilled down prioritization resources from partners. And it'll also be kind of the portal through which people will learn how to apply for grants. And Andy mentioned earlier that we're pulling together informational webinars, and we have a plan for a series of kind of email blasts to go out through hopefully all of your networks as well as our own. So that I think I'm just really excited to be able to share that link with you all once it's live, and you can see kind of what we're pulling together in terms of really starting to ramp up the outreach. So just wanted to flag that because I heard it mentioned several times that people want to make sure that these resources are available to applicants and to the committee, and it is coming very soon.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Okay, well, on that note, we will close this agenda item. Again, expressing our thanks to ODFW, and we'll go to the next item, which is committee membership. I asked that this item be added because 2 terms are coming to an end at the end of this month, both mine and Chad Washington. I've decided to not put my name forward, so I'll be done on September 30 with my term, but I believe Chad does want to continue. So I think the way the process works here is, and I put a little bit that Andy included in the staff report, is that because my affiliation was from the aquatic conservation community, my replacement should be from that community, and that's a decision by the governor under consultation with both the aquatic community and the timber community, as I read it. For all appointments, that's the case. And then, you know, my impression or understanding is that Chad will be putting his name forward for reappointment as well. There's, of course, no requirement for reappointment, but I think it'd be good for anybody who's interested in speaking to his reappointment, or the timber community in particular want to express support, which I'm sure they would, that they can do that. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Anything anybody wants to add here, questions here or comments about this item? Heath, please.
You know, Chad made some similar comments earlier. I wanted, as long as I'm being recorded for posterity, I just wanted to offer, Bob, you have led the opening of this group with such grace and thoughtfulness and persistence. We have been very fortunate to have you serving as chair of this committee, and I consider it a privilege to have worked with you in this capacity, if only for a limited time. Of course, our relationship goes back many years. And, I will be sorry to not have you as a part of this going forward.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you for saying that, Heath. It's been a real privilege to be part of this process, going back some time, and now to see the fruits coming. I just need a bit of a break. So I have noted that Kristen's 2-year term ends next year. So yeah, I may well be interested in rejoining at that point, although less likely to be interested in the chair capacity, I'm certain. So actually, I guess so thanks for that, Heath. I should mention as well that we do have a vice chair, obviously Chad, who at least at the next meeting could serve as chair in my absence, but there'll be a need to pick another chair as well. So any other, but thank you again for that, Heath. It really has been a pleasure to work with you all. Any other comments or questions on this? Mark Stern, please.
Yeah, Bob, I would just second the comments by Heath and Chad and others. I really appreciate your leadership on this, the energy you put into it. Obviously, you had the history with it, and it's just really been great to have you lead it. I'm sorry that you won't continue on, but also appreciate or respect your decision. And again, thank you for all the energy you put into it. You did a great job. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, I think our last agenda item are the closing comments and meeting wrap up. You know, I don't have any comments except to express again my thanks and privilege for having the chance to work here. Andy has helpfully put on the in here a new thing, which is the agenda items, including acquisitions, which I think we all agree needs more discussion. The reporting requirements, which is, you know, again, connected over to monitoring in some ways in the bigger HCP conversation, and appointing a chair, electing a chair at the next meeting are all there. Any other, so I don't have anything else to add. Any other comments on the meeting wrap up?
Hey, Bob,
Yeah.
are you done after this meeting as the chair?
This is it. I'm coming down to the wire here on my, yeah.
Okay.
Obviously there'll be a little follow up, but so yes, this is my last meeting as chair.
Is there an opportunity, or even is it appropriate for you to be in some facilitation leadership role in that conversation about acquisitions in October? Or are you done?
I'm done. I'm gonna turn the crown over to Chad, and
Okay.
yeah, he can have the scepter too. So
Okay.
yeah. Any other, but I'm happy in the weeks ahead to be part of that conversation. If anybody, you know, and I will circle back with Kelly Beamer in particular, who gave those comments, to continue that. So helping form a conversation with Andy and Sarah,
Well,
at the very least, go ahead, Chad, of course. Yeah.
Bob, maybe we can twist your arm to join us for breaking bread and communing when we get together in February for the in-person, just for the happy hour part. We don't even have to talk shop, but I think we would all love the opportunity to like celebrate your leadership in person with you at some point and just say
I
thank
would
you.
welcome that, and we can
Wonderful.
distribute
We would love to have you for that.
That's great. I'd welcome that. We can distribute the Starbucks card to the winner of the lottery.
Who guessed how many gumballs
Yeah.
correctly? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sarah, speaking of that, is that set yet, our in-person meeting? Or not quite yet? Set?
I could probably jump on that. No,
Yeah.
it's not quite yet set. There's still some variables. I'm hoping by the end of September, though, I can send out meeting holds to you guys and to the stream bios for a review process. We were just waiting until we got more comfortable with the launch date and everything. But hopefully by the end of September, it's on my agenda to send out something. It's looking like it's going to be in mid to late February, though. I would presume we're still trying to target that March commission.
Okay. Anything else for the good of the order here today? Okay. Well, thank you all. I'll be seeing you again in February at least.
Thank you, Bob.
Hopefully before then. All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Bob.